Hi everybody, Adam S. here with Prepped and Polished, South Natick, Massachusetts. Today we're going to talk about one of the linchpins of the executive functions, working memory. So working memory, what is it? What do we use it for? What sort of obstacles can arise in students who have challenges with working memory, like ADHD? And what are some strategies we can use to overcome those challenges? So first things first, what is working memory? Well, most often when we use the word memory, we're talking about long-term memory. Long-term memory is the stuff that's tucked away into long-term storage. It's your brain's hard drive. That's information like your address, your best friend's name, the Pythagorean theorem, stuff like that. Most students who struggle with ADHD, Asperger, and other things that challenge their executive functions have no problem at all with long-term memory. Once something makes it in there, they have no problem recalling it. That's where working memory comes in. So what is working memory? Well, if long-term memory is like your brain's hard drive, working memory is like your brain's RAM. It's where we process incoming information. Whenever you have two or more pieces of information vying for your attention, you're engaging your working memory. So working memory describes a series of processes of synthesizing information. So something new comes in, you decide what to do with it. You either apply long-term memory to it to make a decision, or decide to tuck it away so it makes its way into long-term memory. And students who have ADHD, for example, have neurologically based difficulties with their working memory. There's problems with the RAM. So it's not so much that they can't remember something, more often it's that information doesn't make it into long-term memory in the first place. So what are some examples of working memory in action? In reading. So you utilize working memory to remember what you read at the beginning of a paragraph by the time you get to an end of a paragraph. Conversation. Working memory enables you to remember what someone said at the start of a sentence, conversation, dialogue, and remember that to make sense of the topic of the whole at the end. Remembering different steps and multi-step directions, thinking ahead about what's coming next. That's utilizing your working memory. Holding on to important information. If your teacher, for example, says, this is important, write this in your notebook, in order for you to do that, you have to process that information and remember to take action on it. Decision making. For example, taking in new information and comparing that with information you already have in your head. For example, if a teacher says, we have a paper due next Tuesday, conceptualizing how that paper fits in the context of your bigger schedule, or how long something like a paper might take. That's using working memory. And making new long-term memories. So you can choose to act on new information, or you can choose to encode it for long-term data storage. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times, in kids who have difficulty with executive functioning, there's nothing wrong with their long-term memory, but a lot of information never makes it there in the first place. So now that we've talked about what working memory is and what we use it for, let's talk about what can go wrong when there's problems with your working memory. Distractibility. So ADHD or ADD isn't really an issue of attention deficit, it's more an issue of attention surplus. These students pay attention to everything, with no filter for what's important and what's not. So you can imagine if the teacher's telling you something important in class, and one of your friends cracks a joke, whatever the teacher said is going to get overrode by that louder stimuli and kicked right out of your head. So it never even makes it into the long-term memories that they can encode it for later. Difficulty reading. Remember we talked about you use working memory to remember what you read at the beginning of a paragraph by the time you get to the end. Can you imagine how frustrating it would be to try and read, constantly forgetting what you're reading? That's why a lot of times these kids really struggle with reading. And telling them to just try harder is like someone who needs glasses to see to just try harder. It doesn't work, it doesn't make any sense. Forgetting what you're told. Same problem as distractibility. When you get new information, if you can't keep track of what someone's saying, it just comes out like a bunch of nonsense, and new stimulus is going to come and kick that out of your head. And finally, it leads towards a tendency towards experiential learning. A lot of times kids with these kinds of executive functioning issues prefer to learn by doing, because learning by doing engages or puts a much lower load in your working memory than, say, reading about something, trying to conceptualize yourself doing it, and then remembering all that to do it later. So a lot of times if you can figure out programs that are going to enable them to try something, to learn by doing, you'll have more success. So now let's talk about some strategies you can use to overcome difficulties with working memory. Number one, make important tasks stand out. Remember, if you have difficulty filtering which stimuli are the most important, you want to do a better job at externalizing the highlight of what stimuli you really need to pay attention to. So first thing, do things right away. If your mom tells you to take out the trash, take out the trash. Now. Do it before you have the opportunity for something else to come along and knock that idea out of your working memory. Use devices to remind yourself. This can be two things. You can use items as their own reminders. For example, if you're trying to remember to check your schedule every day before you go to school, leave your schedule out, where you sit down and have breakfast. So when you sit down and have breakfast in the morning, you'll see your schedule and it will remind you to check it. Alternatively, you can use a metaphorical string around your finger. Take a highlighter, stick it in your pocket, to remind you to do something when you get home. Then when you get home, you find the highlighter in your pocket and you're like, oh yeah, I was supposed to do whatever. Ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask people you trust, like mom, dad, teachers, friends, to remind you of things that you need to hold on to for later. Highlight important information. Remember, reading can be a real challenge, so you want to do what you can to make the important stuff jump off the page. And finally, you can use notes and technology. Put yellow sticky notes everywhere. Remember to do this, don't forget this. Use your iPhone or iPod to set alarms to remind you to do things for later. So if step number 1 was turning up important stimuli, step number 2 is reducing distractions or turning down the stimuli you don't want to pay attention to. First thing you can do is unplug. When it's time for homework, turn off your phone, your computer if you don't need it for schoolwork. Get off of Facebook. You can use tools like through Mozilla's Firefox or other websites to limit your access to certain websites. If 3 to 5 is homework time, cut yourself off from Facebook. It's going to make you focus on what you need to focus on. Get rid of clutter. If you sit down to a workspace that has books and papers and notes and everything all over the place, that's dozens of little pieces of information screaming for your attention. Get rid of them. Throw out what you can and put away the rest so you can focus on just what's right in front of you. And finally, if you are using to-do lists, which is awesome, cross items off when they're done. Get them off the paper, get them out of your head. Okay, and strategy number 3 is write it down. If you know you have a faulty working memory, take the burden off of it. Externalize everything by putting it on paper. Write out complicated problems. If you're working on a challenging math problem or a problem that needs step-by-step solutions, write out the steps. Otherwise, it's really easy to get to the end and forget where you started and the whole thing doesn't make sense anymore. Write out step-by-step instructions. If you're trying to make cookies, you need to remember what goes in where. Use notes to help yourself keep track of where you are. And finally, you can use technology. You don't have to remember everything. If you have an iPhone or an iPod with you, you can set a reminder, an alarm. Call mom after you get home, or write this down in your notebook when you get home. If you get home around 4 o'clock, set a reminder to go off around 4 o'clock saying, whatever it is you need to do. And the rule with these guys is do it or snooze it. You can't just turn it off. That way, it's going to keep coming back to remind you what you have to do until you finally deal with it. So the common theme of all these strategies is that we're trying to externalize our working memory. Take the burden off of it. We can only keep so many things in our head and our attention at the same time. So let's set ourselves up for success. Let's reduce the distraction, get as much out on paper as we can, so we're not putting as much burden on ourselves. So those are the basics of working memory. Remember the key 3 steps. We want to strengthen the stimuli of important information, reduce distractions, and write everything down. Be sure to join us next time. We're going to talk about sense of time and what that means for our abilities for time management. Until next time.